22 years reading that ground. 22 years knowing exactly what wrong looks like. And in 9 months, it still couldn't be explained. Before we get into it, we're closing in on 1,000 of you down in these woods with us. If you're new, consider this your warning label. Subscribe now, because once you've heard what happened to Miller, you're not going to want to miss the next one.
This is the Nightmare Zoo.
They sent search and rescue into the Selway Bitterroot. Only one came back. They'd been tracking the drag marks through the snow for maybe 3 hours when the thing dropped from the deadfall and landed on Miller's back. And the first thought Eli had wasn't fear. It was that a grizzly bear had finally come down out of the high country early because his brain needed it to be a bear. It gave him about 2 seconds of that before the thing stood up on its hind legs, shaking Miller's blood off its muzzle, and the shoulders kept rising until it was blocking out the moonlight. And whatever he'd been telling himself about predator behavior came apart right there in the snow. This is a story out of the Selway Bitterroot wilderness on the Idaho-Montana border. And I want to walk you through the whole 9 months of it, because the night in the timber was the end of something that had been building since the spring thaw. Let me set the ground first, because the geography does a lot of work in this one. If your picture of Idaho is flat potato farms and interstate rest stops, that's the southern half of the state. Get up into the Panhandle and the Central Mountains, and you're in different country entirely. The Selway Bitterroot is over 2 million acres of designated roadless wilderness. It's steep, brutal, unforgiving country. Canyons that drop 2,000 feet in a half-mile, ridges covered in lodgepole pine and subalpine fir, and valleys so deep the snow doesn't melt until July. It's poor country, and it's wild country. There are tracts of it where you can walk for 4 days and never see a footprint that isn't your own. The account I'm going to tell you has been circulating in the Idaho County Search and Rescue Network for a while now. The man in it doesn't use his real name on the radio frequencies, so we'll call him Eli. Eli was in his late 40s, and he was the lead tracker for the Regional SAR volunteer team. If you don't know the job, when someone goes missing in the backcountry, the county calls these volunteers. They're the guys who hike in with the dogs, the thermal drones, and the first aid kits. Eli had been doing it for 22 years. He knew that ground the way a bloodhound knows a scent. He knew which ravines held snow in August, which ridges had loose scree that would break an ankle, and how the wind moved through the canyons. I put that in because it matters for everything after. When a man like that tells you something on his route was wrong, he's working from 22 years of knowing exactly what right looks like. It started in May, and it started small enough that he didn't think about it. He was tracking a missing day hiker up a drainage off the Selway River. He found the hiker's camp, but the tent hadn't just been blown over. It had been shredded. Not torn from the outside by a bear looking for food, but shredded from the inside. The nylon was ripped outward in long frayed strips, and the sleeping bag inside was soaked in blood, but there was no body. He assumed a bear had dragged the hiker out of the tent. But then he found the drag marks. They didn't look like a bear pulling a body by the leg. The tracks in the mud were bipedal, 2 feet, but the stride was 6 feet long, and the prints were the size of dinner plates, with drag marks from claws that were at least 4 inches long. He reported it as a bear taking a man, because there wasn't another box to put it in. Then, about 6 weeks later, on a completely different ridge, they found an elk kill. Now, Eli has seen hundreds of elk kills. A cougar caches it and covers it in brush. A wolf pack tears it apart and leaves a messy, scattered carcass. A bear eats the fat and leaves the rest. This elk had been opened up. The rib cage wasn't just cracked. It had been snapped outward, like someone had put a boot inside the chest and kicked. The spine was severed cleanly, and the meat wasn't just eaten. It was consumed. The bones were stripped so clean they looked like they'd been boiled. There were no scavenger marks. No raven feathers, no coyote tracks. Just a massive surgical-level butchery job in the middle of the woods. Now, that explanation held up fine for about 2 months. Through June and into July, nothing else happened. Eli forgot about the torn tent. But it picked back up in August, and it picked up with the smell. He was hiking into a base camp on a hot afternoon, and about 100 yards short of the site, the smell hit him. He described it as a butcher's freezer that had been unplugged in the sun, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of wet copper and old ash. Strong enough that it made his eyes water and his stomach turn. Eli looked for a carcass. That's the reasonable thing. He walked the tree line, found nothing. No dead elk, no rotting deer, no flies working anything. He did his checks, and he left. And the smell was gone the second he crossed back over the creek. Not faded, gone. The way a smell goes when its source is moved. That's the first thing he told people about later that made them look at him differently. September is when he put the camera up. He bought a high-end Reconix trail cam, strapped it to a ponderosa pine about 50 yards from the elk kill site, and angled it at the game trail. He told his team lead he was trying to figure out what kind of bear was moving through the area. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth by then. He ran that camera for 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, it took a little over 800 photographs. And I want to be clear about what was in them, because this is the part where the story could have ended and didn't. Black bears, a grizzly, elk, a marten. Nothing else. Not one frame of anything he couldn't name. But there were 5 nights in those 4 weeks where the camera fired a burst of photographs at the empty trail in the dark with nothing in any of them. Now, trail cameras false trigger. Anyone who runs them will tell you they get junk frames. Eli knew that. What bothered him was the timing. All 5 of those empty bursts happened between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. And on the last one, in the corner of the final frame, the infrared flash had caught something at the very edge of the lens. It was a shoulder. Matted, dark fur, but the muscle structure underneath was wrong. It was too broad, and the arm hanging down from it had an elbow that bent backward. He'd tell you himself it could have been a trick of the infrared on a twisted branch, but he'd been photographing that same trail for 4 weeks, and there were no branches in that spot. He pulled the camera that day, and he didn't put it back up. Through October, it got loud. Eli started hearing a sound in the deep draws. If you've spent time around this subject, you know about wolf howls. This wasn't that. This was a sound like a heavy, wet canvas being torn in half, followed by a low, vibrating chuff that he said he felt in his molars more than he heard with his ears, like a diesel engine idling inside a chest cavity. He heard that pattern 4 separate times in October, always at dusk, always when he was alone. And he'd tell you, and I think this is honest of him, that a chuff is a chuff. Bear's chuff, cougar's chuff. But a bear doesn't make a sound that echoes back from the other side of a canyon in a rhythm that matches your own heartbeat. The last week of October, he was packing up his gear at dusk when something stepped out of the brush on the opposite bank, about 80 feet away. Eli never got past describing it in negatives, which frustrated everybody who ever asked him about it. He'd seen grizzlies, and he'd say it wasn't that. He'd seen wolves, and he'd say it wasn't that. What he described was this. It was incredibly tall, pushing 9 feet on its hind legs. It was covered in dark, matted fur, but the chest and the shoulders were hairless, showing gray, scarred skin underneath. It was massively built, but the limbs were impossibly long, hanging down past its hocks, and it just stood there. That's the part that did the damage. It didn't charge. It didn't retreat. It stood in the fading light across the river, and it watched him. And it did that for what Eli estimated at 30 seconds. Then it opened its mouth, and it didn't roar. It mimicked. It played back the sound of a man screaming for help, but the cadence was wrong. It was a perfect, looping recording of a human scream, coming from a throat that was 3 times the size of a man's. And he said that's when the last piece of the rational theory died, because a bear doesn't mimic human distress calls. It dropped its head, turned, and walked back into the brush. It moved in short, jerky bursts, and it made absolutely no sound when it moved through the deadfall. Eli sat on a log for another 20 minutes with his head in his hands before he ever picked up his pack. He hiked the 4 miles back to his truck in the dark, which he hadn't done in 22 years of the job. He didn't tell his team lead about it. He told one other man, an retired state game warden named Mac, who'd worked the Selway country since the late 70s. The way the story goes, Mac listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he asked one question, which was whether Eli had smelled copper when the thing opened its mouth. Eli said yes. And Mac said, "Well, that's about right." And he told him a story about the old mountain men and the fur trappers from the 1880s. And he said the men who worked those deep drainages had a rule they never wrote down, which was that when you hear a voice in the deep timber that doesn't sound out of breath, you drop your gear. You don't look up, and you climb the highest tree you can find. Eli asked him what the thing was. Mac said he'd worked those hills for 40 years and had only heard that sound twice, and he'd kept his eyes on the dirt both times, and that he'd made a decision a long time ago to keep it that way. I want to sit on that exchange for a second, because I think it's the most useful thing in this whole account. Mac wasn't a believer in the way we usually mean that word. He never claimed to have seen anything. He'd have laughed at you if you'd asked him to go looking. What he had was 40 years of a working rule that he'd inherited from men who worked that ground before him. And he followed it the way you'd follow a rule about not walking under a suspended load. When you hear a voice that doesn't breathe, you climb. Nobody explained it to him, and he never asked. And by the time he was telling Eli about it, he was 10 years retired and had no reason to invent anything. That's how this kind of knowledge actually moves through a workforce, not as a campfire story, but as a survival protocol that gets handed down without a reason attached until eventually there's a whole crew arranging its day around something none of them will say out loud. If you've worked a remote route, a fire line, a deep-sea trawler, you already know exactly what I'm describing. There's always a rule like that. There's always some condition the old hands avoid. And if you're new and you ask why, so that was the situation going into the second week of November. The call came in a little after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A hunter had gone missing up in the high country, the far side of the Bitterroot Divide, 12 miles of brutal elevation off the nearest road. On a summer day, they'd have gone up without thinking about it. On this night, with the first snow of the year falling, Eli sat in his own driveway for a while first. He went in the end, because a missing hunter in a November blizzard is a body recovery if you wait until morning. Eli led a team of 4. Himself Miller, a guy named Davis, and a rookie named Sarah. They hiked in through the dark, fighting the snow, using high-lumen flashlights to cut through the whiteout. They found the hunter's camp at about 9 p.m. The tent was shredded from the inside, and then they found the hunter. Or they found what the thing had left of him. I need to be clear about what Eli saw here, because this is where the story stops being a mystery and starts being a horror. The hunter's torso was there, but it had been opened up, not bitten, torn. The rib cage was cracked wide, the sternum snapped backward and pinned into the snow. His internal organs had been pulled out, but they weren't scattered. They were arranged in a neat, deliberate pile 3 feet away, steaming in the cold air. The ground around him was saturated, the snow black and thick with his blood. His head was. I'm going to spare you the details of his face, but Eli said the jaw was unhinged and pulled down to his chest, and the eyes were gone. Not eaten, poked out. 2 perfect bloody holes. Sarah threw up. Miller unslung his rifle. Eli was staring at the organ pile, his brain trying to process the geometry of it when the smell hit them. the butcher's freezer, the wet copper. And then the thing dropped from the deadfall above them and landed on Miller's back. It didn't just bite him. It caught his shoulder in its jaws and shook him like a ragdoll. Eli heard the wet, heavy tear of the rotator cuff giving way, followed by the sound of Miller's collarbone snapping like a dry branch. Miller didn't even have time to scream before the thing's front paw came down and caved in his chest. The sound was like a wet melon being dropped on concrete. Miller's ribs punched through his own back, tearing through his jacket, and the thing threw his body into the snow like it weighed nothing. Davis raised his .308 and fired. Eli saw the muzzle flash, and he saw the round hit the thing in the shoulder. A round that would drop a grizzly at 100 yards. The thing's shoulder exploded in a spray of black blood and torn fur, but it didn't even flinch. It turned its head, and its jaws clamped over Davis's helmet and his head. Eli said the sound of the Kevlar cracking was louder than the gunshot. Then the jaw pressure increased. The helmet split down the middle with a sound like a car crash. The thing threw its head back, and the top half of the helmet and whatever was inside it came away in its mouth. The spray of arterial blood hit Eli's face from 10 feet away. It was hot, and it smelled like iron and salt. Sarah was frozen. She was just standing there, her flashlight shaking, staring at the thing as it chewed. Eli grabbed her harness, yanked her backward, and screamed at her to run. They dropped their packs. They ran into the dark, through the snow, without flashlights, listening to the wet, tearing sounds behind them, and the low, vibrating chuff that shook the ground under their boots. Eli and Sarah ran for 4 miles in the dark. Sarah twisted her ankle twice. Eli practically carried her. They didn't stop until they hit the truck. They called it in, and the extraction team went up at first light with the state police. They found Miller. His chest was a crater. They found Davis's helmet, crushed in half, 50 yards away. They never found Davis, and they found the hunter, exactly as Eli had described him. Now I'll lay out the ordinary explanations. Because they deserve a hearing. The Selway Bitterroot has grizzly bears. A grizzly can do that damage. A grizzly can crush a chest and snap a spine. And every year, that's what a certain number of these maulings turn out to be. There's also the plain fact that Eli and his team were exhausted, freezing, and terrified, which is a state of mind that will help you see things. Any of those could be it. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. What I'd point out is that the ordinary explanations work best on the last night and worst on everything before it. A grizzly doesn't shred a tent from the inside out. A grizzly doesn't arrange a man's organs in a deliberate pile. A grizzly doesn't catch a .308 to the shoulder and keep walking. And a grizzly doesn't stand on its hind legs and mimic a human scream. And a bear doesn't leave tracks with a 6-foot stride and 4-inch claws. The other thing worth knowing is that the deep northern Rockies have a tradition about this going back a long way. There are stories from the Nez Perce and the Salish about things that live in the high draws, things that wear the skins of the animals they kill, things that hunger for human marrow. I'm not going to lean on the specific names, because the moment you attach a name to an account like this, you've told the audience what to picture. And the value in Eli's version is that he wouldn't do that himself. But the lore exists, and it's old, and it predates every piece of technology we now expect to settle these questions. The old fur trapper journals from the 1880s talk about the butchers of the Bitterroot, massive bipedal wolves that stalk the trapping lines in the deep winter. Think about what that region actually is for a moment. 2 million acres of unbroken, roadless, brutal wilderness. A lot of it at high elevation, where no one walks through it in a given year. There is more unwatched forest in the northern Rockies today than there was in 1850. So the question of whether a massive, anomalous predator could move through that country without being photographed isn't really the interesting question. The interesting question is why. With every tracker, hunter, And biologist who's worked those hills, carrying a camera in his pocket for 20 years now, the record hasn't gotten any better. Eli's answer to that, when somebody put it to him, was that he'd had his phone in his pocket when the thing dropped on Miller, and it never once occurred to him to reach for it, because some part of his brain knew that taking a picture of it would make it notice him. Eli never used a name for it. In every version of this account, when somebody asked him what he thought he saw, he gave the same answer. He said he saw something that was already there when the flashlights found it, and that it left when it decided to, and that in 22 years of pulling lost people out of the woods, it was the only time he ever felt like the woods were actively hunting him back. He quit SAR the next day. He still lives in Idaho, but he doesn't go east of the interstate. And he never changed a word of it and never tried to make money off it. So what do you do with that? A man with 22 years of root knowledge, 9 months of small wrong things, 30 seconds in a flashlight beam, and a chest cavity caved in by something that eats search and rescue. I'll leave it where he left it. If you've spent time in the Selway Bitterroot, in those deep draws off the high ridges where the snow stays until July and the wind sounds like screaming, I want to hear about it in the comments, especially if you've worked out there alone at night. There are more of these accounts out of that corner of the country than most people realize. And they don't get told much, because the people telling them mostly have to keep working out there. Thanks for watching The Nightmare Zoo. If you've got a story from the deep woods, drop it in the comments below. Stay safe out there, and keep your eyes on the tree line.